I want you to put yourself in a very specific, very terrifying position right now.
Okay, I'm ready.
You are 40,000 feet above the surface of the moon.
That is quite the vantage point.
Right, and you are moving across this alien landscape at roughly 3,000 miles per hour.
Which is fast. Very fast.
Exactly. And you are strapped in, well, actually, you're standing up. You're standing inside this vehicle, the lunar module.
The famous spider.
Yeah. And the walls of this thing are so thin that in some places they are essentially just the thickness of a few layers of aluminum foil.
I mean, you could literally poke a pencil through them if you weren't careful.
You really could. So you're in this tin can, and the sensation isn't some smooth, graceful gliding like you see in sci-fi movies.
Oh, not at all. It is rattling.
Yeah.
The descent engine is firing right beneath you, and it's just vibrating the floorboards straight through the soles of your boots.
But the real problem isn't the vibration, right? It's what you're seeing out the window.
Right, because you're Neil Armstrong, and you're looking out that little triangular window trying to scan the surface.
Right. He's looking for these specific landmarks he had memorized from orbital maps back on Earth.
And he sees one. He sees this specific crater, masculine W.
But here is the massive problem. He sees it 3 seconds too early.
Which, in the context of driving a car to the grocery store sounds completely irrelevant.
Yeah, if you miss your exit on the highway by 3 seconds, you just take the next one.
Exactly. But in orbital mechanics, specifically during a powered descent to the lunar surface, 3 seconds is a massive, massive error.
Because it means they're traveling faster than the computer thinks they are.
Right. Being long, that is the technical term. They are long downrange.
So that 3-second error, what does that actually translate to on the ground?
It translates to roughly 3 miles.
Wow.
Yeah. It means the computer is currently guiding them not to that nice, smooth, flat landing zone they meticulously picked out back in Houston.
It's taking them somewhere else.
It's taking them into a field of car-sized boulders 3 miles to the west.
And just as that terrifying realization starts to hit that the navigation is off, that they're speeding towards a literal debris field, the computer just starts screaming at them.
The infamous 1202 alarm.
Yeah. And this isn't just a standard check engine light on your dashboard.
No, this is a code that neither Armstrong nor Buzz Aldrin had explicitly seen or trained for in those final simulator runs leading up to the mission.
It's a program alarm. It basically means the computer's overloaded. It is choking on too much data.
Right. So imagine the stress. You have a pilot who realizes he needs to fly this fragile machine manually because the autopilot is about to crash them into rocks.
Right.
But the computer, the very thing that controls the throttle and keeps the craft stable, is basically throwing up its hands and shouting, "I give up."
And meanwhile, Houston just goes completely silent.
Yeah, if you listen to the tapes, there's this agonizing gap.
Because the flight controllers back on Earth are frantically scrambling through their notes to even figure out what a 1202 code means.
All while the fuel is just burning away, and they are rapidly passing what they call the dead man's box.
The dead man's box, which is just such a chilling phrase.
It really is. We are definitely going to unpack all of this today. The dead man's box, the extreme fuel crisis, that whole computer overload situation.
Yeah, because to really appreciate the absolute insanity of that moment, that final descent, we have to back up a bit.
We do.
Because today's deep dive is focusing on a phenomenal book, Moonshot, the inside story of mankind's greatest adventure by Dan Parry.
Such a great source.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive is pretty specific. We want to strip away that glossy, perfect poster image of Apollo 11.
You know the one? The pristine white school suit, the stiff American flag, the crisp salutes.
Right. That is the victory lap.
Yeah.
But what Moonshot argues so compellingly is that the reality was much grittier.
Much more dangerous.
Exactly. It was a story of just terrifying fragility.
It really was. I think we tend to view history backwards,
What do you mean by that?
Well, we know they made it. We have the photos, so we just sort of assume their success was inevitable.
Oh, right. Like it was always destined to work out perfectly.
Exactly. But Perry's work does this fantastic job of putting you right back in that moment where it was actually highly improbable that they would succeed.
It's a story about the intersection of intense Cold War paranoia, the sheer art of flying by the seat of your pants, and the very dawn of digital computing.
All colliding at once.
Yeah. And it's about 3 men who were, frankly, very different kinds of human beings.
Very different.
But before we get to the flesh and blood of the crew, I feel like we have to talk about the beast that actually threw them at the moon in the first place.
The Saturn V. The beast on the pad.
Yes. And I honestly feel like the word rocket is just too small a word for this thing.
It really doesn't do it justice.
It's a monument. It stood 363 feet tall.
Which is basically a 36-story building.
A 36-story building completely filled to the brim with high explosives.
To this day, it remains the most powerful machine human beings have ever successfully built and operated.
And when you read the granular engineering details in Parry's book, you realize it wasn't just this static metal object sitting on a launch pad.
No, it was almost biological.
Right. You're talking about the breathing, the shrinkage.
Yes, the shrinkage. This is one of those details that really emphasizes the crazy extremes they were working with.
Walk us through that.
So the rocket is built mostly of aluminum and steel alloys, right?
Right.
And it just sits there baking in the hot Florida sun.
Get nice and warm.
Exactly. But then, a few hours before launch, the ground crews start pumping in the cryogenic propellants.
The fuel, liquid oxygen at minus 182 degrees Celsius.
Right. And liquid hydrogen at minus 252 degrees Celsius.
Which is just incomprehensibly cold.
It is remarkably close to absolute zero. So when you dump millions of pounds of that ultra-cold liquid into a giant metal structure, the metal violently reacts.
It contracts.
It contracts a lot. The entire 363-foot tall rocket would literally shrink by about 8 full inches in height as it was being fueled.
Which, if you just pause and think about the engineering headache that causes, is mind-blowing.
Right, because you have solid fuel lines, delicate electrical wiring, rigid hydraulic systems running the entire vertical length of this massive vehicle.
And if the exterior frame suddenly shrinks by 8 inches, all those taut lines and pipes should just snap.
They absolutely should. So the engineers had to design these complex accordion-like bellows and expansion loops into practically every single pipe and wire on the rocket.
The whole machine had to be flexible. It had to literally bend and shift.
Yeah, and visually, it was just a stunning sight on the pad.
Yeah.
Because that ultra-cold fuel meeting the humid, sticky Florida air created these massive rolling clouds of condensation vapor.
It looked like the beast was exhaling, like it was sweating ice.
Sweating ice is a great way to put it.
And then they light it. The F1 engines. All 5 of them at the base.
The F1 is still an absolute marvel of engineering. Each individual engine is roughly the size of a small house.
And together, those 5 engines generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust.
But the statistic that always floors me every single time I read it is the fuel consumption rate.
Oh, right. It's 15 tons per second.
Just try to visualize that in your head. 15 tons. That is the equivalent weight of roughly 10 mid-sized family cars.
Gone.
Burned up, vanished into fire, every single second.
It is truly a controlled explosion. And the word controlled is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence.
Barely controlled, honestly. I mean, combustion instability was a massive program-threatening issue during the early development.
They called it pogoing, right?
Right. Essentially, the giant engine burns so intensely that it actually creates a localized vacuum that sucks even more fuel down the pipes.
Which then creates a slightly bigger boom.
Exactly. Which violently shakes the rocket, which sloshes the fuel tanks above, which causes a surge in pressure, which feeds back into the engine.
Like a terrifying feedback loop.
A feedback loop that can completely shake the rocket apart into shrapnel in seconds.
Now, they did fix that eventually, right?
Right.
With special baffles inside the fuel injectors.
They did, yes. But the sheer violence of the launch remained. When that thing finally lifted off, it wasn't just loud.
Right, because sound is just pressure waves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the acoustic energy pouring out of the Saturn V was so incredibly high that if you stood too close to the pad, the sound waves alone would liquefy your internal organs.
The noise alone would kill you.
It would kill you dead.
Parry mentions the sheer physical radius of that acoustic force in the book. Like during the Apollo 4 unmanned test launch.
Oh, yeah, the Walter Cronkite story.
Right. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, was sitting in the CBS broadcast booth.
Which was miles away from the launch pad.
Miles away. And the vibration was so intense that the acoustic ceiling tiles literally started falling on his head during the live broadcast.
Just getting bonked by debris while trying to report the news.
And the spectators, too. Parry talks about normal people feeling the ground shaking so violently against their legs.
It's such a great visceral detail. Spectators literally found physical bruises on their thighs the next morning.
From the sound.
From the ground vibration. They had been leaning against metal railings, or they had their heavy binoculars resting on their laps, and the ground shuddered so intensely it physically battered them against their own equipment.
That is wild. Now, put 3 guys in a tiny pod on the very top of that shaking tower.
This is where that theme of extreme fragility really kicks into high gear.
Yeah, because Michael Collins described that ascent to space. And he made it very clear it wasn't this majestic, smooth, slow-motion rise that we always see in the archival NASA footage.
No, not at all. He famously compared the feeling of the launch to riding with a nervous lady driving a wide car down a narrow alley.
I love that quote, just constantly jerking back and forth.
Right, because those huge gimbaled engines at the bottom are frantically swiveling, constantly correcting the steering to keep this massive skyscraper balanced upright.
Yeah. So the ride is incredibly violent. They're just being repeatedly slammed against their contoured couches.
While pulling 4 Gs, which means they're feeling 4 times their normal body weight pressing down on their chests as they punch through the thickening atmosphere.
And Collins had this really poignant metaphor that I think beautifully defines the whole Apollo mission. He called it carrying the fire.
It's poetic, for sure, but it's also deeply technical. He viewed the entire mission as carrying a tiny, fragile flame representing the spark of human life, or perhaps just the crew's precarious safety through a violent storm.
Because you really have to remember the insane weight ratios of this machine. 90% of the entire Saturn V on the pad is propellant.
It is almost entirely made of highly explosive fuel.
And the command module, the little cone at the very top where the 3 human beings actually live and breathe, is only 0.2% of the total vehicle weight.
Just 0.2%.
That is their margin for survival. They're the tiny, delicate tip of a massive spear made of liquid explosives.
And their primary job, essentially, is just to ride that continuous explosion without letting it kill them.
So let's talk about the specific men who volunteered to ride that spear. Because Moonshot does an incredible job of stripping away that generic hero veneer.
They were not just carbon copy generic astronauts.
No, they were 3 radically different personalities with very different motivations for being there.
We absolutely have to start with the commander, Neil Armstrong.
The ice commander.
That was his reputation around the office. He was notoriously quiet, enigmatic.
Parry notes that Armstrong was a man who deliberately thought before he spoke. Every single time.
And in that 1960s world of fast-talking, hard-drinking, ego-driven fighter pilots, that made him a massive outlier.
Because he actually viewed himself as an engineer first, right?
He really did. He wasn't in the space program for the glory or the romance of flight. He was there for the pure mechanics of it.
Right. Since he was a little kid in Ohio, he was obsessively building complex model planes out of straw and balsa wood.
He fundamentally wanted to understand how the machine worked.
But despite being an engineer at heart, he was a hell of a pilot. We definitely have to talk about the X-15 incident.
Oh, this is so critical to understanding exactly why he was chosen for the first moon landing.
Right, because the X-15 was this insane experimental rocket plane. It dropped from a bomber and flew to the very edge of space.
And on one specific flight, Armstrong was coming back down into the atmosphere at hypersonic speed, and he was supposed to test a new maneuvering system.
But he kept the nose of the plane up just a little too long.
He did, and because of that angle, he actually bounced.
Like a rock on a lake.
Literally skipped right off the upper atmosphere. He bounced back up into space.
Which means he completely overshot his intended landing site in the Mojave Desert.
Completely missed it. He ended up gliding way off course, completely unpowered, over Pasadena, which is miles and miles away from the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base.
Now, on paper, that sounds like a massive failure on his part.
In a strict testing sense, it was a failure. But, and this is the key, he managed to calmly turn that dead-stick rocket plane around, perfectly manage his remaining energy, and glide it all the way back to safely land on a dry lake bed.
So it proved he had this uncanny ability to handle a terrifying situation where all the planned parameters were completely thrown out the window.
Exactly. He didn't panic.
But there's a much darker, more tragic side to his quietness. The book delves into the heartbreaking tragedy of his daughter, Karen.
Yeah. This is really the emotional core of Neil Armstrong that the general public rarely sees or understands. His daughter, Karen, tragically died of a brain tumor in January 1962.
She wasn't even 3 years old yet.
Not quite 3. And his reaction to that profound loss wasn't to break down and mourn publicly.
No, he was famously stoic. He went right back to work almost immediately.
His own sister later said she firmly believed his heart was completely breaking inside, but he simply never allowed himself to show it.
He channeled all of that unbearable grief into a fierce, almost robotic focus on his engineering work.
which is exactly what allowed him to so completely compartmentalize fear.
And that precise ability to compartmentalize fear is what saved his life and Dave Scott's life on Gemini 8.
Gemini 8, the very first docking between two vehicles in space.
Right. It was supposed to be a relatively smooth test mission. They dock their Gemini capsule with this uncrewed Agena target vehicle.
And suddenly, out of nowhere, the entire dock stack just starts to roll. Violently.
And Armstrong immediately assumes the problems with the other vehicle, right? The Agena.
Naturally. Because the Agena was the brand new, untested piece of hardware. But it wasn't the Agena at all.
It was his own shit.
It was his own capsule. Thruster number 8 on the Gemini was stuck wide open, just blasting away.
So they undock from the Agena thinking that will solve the problem.
But undocking just made the Gemini capsule much lighter. So without the massive Agena holding it back, it spun even faster.
They hit a spin rate of 1 full revolution per second.
Imagine sitting in an office chair and spinning around completely once every single second.
Now try doing that while looking at a tiny window at the Earth flashing past you in a blur.
You are instantly on the verge of physiological incapacitation. Your eyes can't track, you get intense tunnel vision.
Blackout is just seconds away at that point.
And if you black out while spinning in a vacuum, you die.
But Armstrong, deep inside that absolute chaos, somehow had the cool presence of mind to logically deduce that the main maneuvering thrusters were the problem.
Right. So he systematically shut them all down, and then he manually activated the re-entry control system, the RCS, to forcefully stop the spin.
But firing the RCS meant the mission was instantly over, by the rules.
Those were the strict mission rules. If you crack the seal on your re-entry fuel in orbit, you have to abort and come straight home.
So he technically failed the primary mission objectives, but to NASA management, to Deke Slayton, the head of the astronaut office,
it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Neil Armstrong was the guy you want in the seat.
Because he didn't panic. He logically solved a fatal problem while spinning at literal death speed.
Exactly. So that is Armstrong, the ice water in the veins. But then you have Buzz Aldrin sitting right next to him, a completely different animal.
Dr. Rendezvous.
To pure academic.
Buzz was the very first astronaut to join the program with a full-blown PhD.
And he absolutely wore that degree on his sleeve. His doctoral thesis from MIT was titled, "And I have to get this right line of sight guidance techniques for manned orbital rendezvous."
Which is quite a mouthful, but basically it was the complex math of how to actually find and intercept someone else moving in space.
And at the time he wrote it, the old-school grizzled test pilots at NASA thought it was just theoretical academic nonsense.
They were the traditional stick and rudder guys.
Right. They just thought, hey, I can see the target out the window, I'll just step on the gas and fly straight to it.
But Buzz was the one stubbornly insisting, no, you can't do that. The orbital mechanics are completely counterintuitive. You have to use the math.
He had a massive chip on his shoulder about it, though.
He really did.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't an experimental test pilot by trade, which was basically the golden ticket for respect in those early days. So he had to aggressively fight his way into the program. And he also had a very demanding father, Gene Aldrin, pushing him from behind.
Right. Gene Aldrin was a legendary aviation pioneer in his own right, a personal friend of Orville Wright and Charles Lindbergh.
So the shadowy cast was huge.
Incredibly demanding. For Buzz, just getting selected by NASA wasn't nearly enough to satisfy his dad. Walking on the moon wasn't even enough.
Because his father was actually furious that Buzz wasn't going to be the first man out the door.
Exactly. Second place was viewed as a failure, so there was this intense, constant internal pressure for Buzz to relentlessly prove his worth.
But professionally speaking, he undeniably proved his worth on Gemini 12.
Oh, he absolutely saved the entire EVA spacewalk program.
Because before Buzz flew, spacewalks were turning into absolute nightmares for NASA.
Complete disasters. Astronauts were rapidly overheating, their heart rates were spiking dangerously, their visors were totally fogging up with sweat.
They couldn't even manage to turn simple wrenches.
Because in zero gravity, if you try to forcefully turn a wrench on a bolt, the bolt stays still and you spin around in a circle. Action and reaction.
So Buzz comes in, and his big solution is the swimming pool.
Right. Underwater training, neutral buoyancy.
Which seems so obvious to us now, seeing modern astronauts train.
But back then, it was a totally novel concept. Buzz was the guy who eagerly volunteered to spend hours and hours in a scuba suit working on mock-ups underwater to build up that specific zero-G muscle memory.
And when he finally got up to space on Gemini 12, he just breezed through every single task perfectly.
He never broke a sweat. He decisively proved that Dr. Rendezvous wasn't just some dusty academic nerd. He was a highly disciplined master technician in a vacuum.
And then we have the third man, the guy who had to stay behind, Michael Collins.
The philosopher. He really was the glue that held that crew together.
Collins really comes across in the book as the one guy you'd actually want to sit down and have a beer with.
Oh, absolutely. He was born in Rome, grew up as an army brat traveling the world. He was clearly brilliant, but he freely admitted to being kind of lazy in high school.
He just had this wonderfully easygoing, slightly fatalistic sense of humor about the whole crazy endeavor.
But he very nearly missed the boat completely.
Right. The terrifying medical scare.
Right.
The bone spur.
Yeah. He was originally slated to fly on Apollo 8, but out of nowhere, he started developing these strange neurological symptoms.
His legs were literally just giving out on them.
It turned out to be a rogue bone spur growing inside his neck, physically pressing hard against his spinal cord.
Which, in the high-performance aviation world, is usually an instant, permanent grounding condition.
It absolutely should have been the end of his career. But he chose to undergo a tremendously risky surgery called an anterior cervical fusion.
They literally have to go in through the front of your throat to fuse the vertebrae in your neck.
If the surgeon's hand slips, he's paralyzed for life or dead. And even if it goes perfectly right, the flight surgeons might still never clear him to fly high-G rockets ever again.
But he did heal.
He healed beautifully. But during his recovery, he officially lost his prime slot on Apollo 8.
Which, by an incredible twist of fate, is exactly what bumped him into the rotation to fly on Apollo 11. But his designated role, the Command Module Pilot, or CMP, was arguably the most psychologically demanding job of all.
Because he knew from the very beginning that he would not get to walk on the moon.
He would literally just drop his two friends off at the station.
And then he would officially become the loneliest man in human history.
Orbiting all alone on the dark side of the moon, completely cut off from all radio contact with Earth or his crew.
And his general attitude about taking on that immense psychological burden was basically just, I'm not going to sweat it.
That is just so perfectly Collins. He didn't have Aldrin's burning ego, and he didn't have Armstrong's intense robotic drive. He was just genuinely happy to be the guy carrying the fire.
So we have the unbelievable machine, and we have the three very unique men.
But we need to properly set the historical stage here, because Apollo 11 obviously didn't just spontaneously happen in a vacuum.
Well, literally, it operated in a vacuum.
Fair point. Physically in a vacuum.
Yeah.
But politically and historically, this triumph crawled out of a very dark, very tragic place.
We have to talk about the fire.
Apollo 1. You really cannot honestly tell the triumphant story of the landing without telling the devastating story of the fire first.
January 1967. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee.
It was supposed to just be a routine plugs-out test on the ground.
Right. They were strapped into the capsule on top of the massive rocket at Cape Kennedy. The rocket itself wasn't even fueled up yet, but the capsule door was tightly sealed.
And because of NASA's prevailing design philosophy at that time, the cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen.
100% pure oxygen.
At 16.7 psi.
Yeah.
Which is actually higher than normal atmospheric pressure on Earth.
And in that incredibly oxygen-rich, high-pressure environment, materials that are normally completely fire-resistant suddenly become highly explosive.
Materials like Velcro.
Velcro was everywhere inside that spacecraft. They used massive strips of it to stick their paper checklists, their pens, and their cameras to the cabin walls so they wouldn't float away in zero gravity.
But in normal air, Velcro just quietly smolders if it gets hot.
Right. But soak it in high-pressure, pure oxygen, and it explodes like it's made of gasoline.
And the spark that set it off.
It's just a tiny, single frayed electrical wire somewhere down underneath Gus Grissom's seat.
That one tiny spark instantly ignited the Velcro, and a massive wall of fire consumed the entire cabin almost instantly, and they couldn't get out. This is the part that just genuinely makes me angry when I look back at the engineering decisions. The hatch.
The infamous plug hatch. It was a complex, multi-piece hatch that opened inward into the cabin.
Because the original idea was that the vacuum pressure of space pulling outward would constantly push the hatch tight against its seals, automatically making it airtight.
Which is a very clever passive safety design for when you were actually up in space.
But down on the ground, when there's suddenly a raging fire inside,
the immense heat of the fire rapidly expanded the gas inside. The internal pressure completely skyrocketed in seconds.
So all that pressure was pressing against that inward opening door with thousands and thousands of pounds of force.
No human being alive could have possibly pulled it open against that pressure. They were effectively sealed inside a burning high-pressure tank.
It took the frantic ground crew more than 5 minutes to finally pry the door open.
And the crew was already gone in under 17 seconds.
This tragedy just completely stopped everything in its tracks.
It absolutely broke NASA's heart, but importantly, it also instantly stopped the dangerous go fever.
They had been rushing so recklessly to beat the Russians.
The fire forced a total agonizing stand-down. They tore the ship apart, and they found 5,600 individual things wrong with that original Block I spacecraft design.
5,600 defects.
Bad wiring, highly flammable materials everywhere, switches that could easily short-circuit.
So the Block II spacecraft, the heavily modified version that Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins eventually flew, was a completely different, infinitely safer machine because of that terrible fire.
The hatch was completely redesigned to blow violently outward in less than 5 seconds. The atmosphere on the pad was permanently changed to a much safer nitrogen-oxygen mix.
And Parry makes the very stark argument in the book that without the harsh lessons of the fire, Apollo 11 would have undoubtedly failed.
It's a very grim calculus to make, but he's likely right. If they had somehow launched that flawed Block I spacecraft exactly as it was, something critical would have eventually sparked or failed on the way to the moon.
And if you have an oxygen fire halfway to the moon, there's absolutely no ground crew outside the window to help you.
You're just gone.
And while NASA is painfully rebuilding from the ashes of Apollo 1, the Soviet Union is constantly haunting their every move.
The shadow of the space race. I think we often forget today just how real and existential the Soviet threat felt at the time.
Because the Soviets had literally beaten the U.S. to everything early on.
First satellite with Sputnik, first man in space with Gagarin, first spacewalk with Leonov.
And then came the Zond 5 mission, the Turtles.
I know it sounds almost funny now, sending literal turtles to the moon, but at the time, it was a terrifying strategic masterstroke by the Soviets.
This was in September 1968. The Soviets launched an uncrewed probe called Zond 5. It successfully circled around the moon and safely returned to splash down on Earth.
With the turtles inside still perfectly alive.
Turtles, mealworms, wine flies. It was a biological payload.
And what it decisively proved to the world was that the Soviets finally had the heavy rocket power to send a substantial payload around the moon and the precise guidance systems to safely bring it back through the atmosphere at high re-entry speeds.
NASA was absolutely terrified.
Because the logic was simple. If they can successfully send a turtle today, they can send a cosmonaut tomorrow.
Even if the Soviets don't have a lander ready, if they just safely orbit a Russian around the moon first and take some photos, they permanently win the propaganda war. That intense fear of losing is exactly what triggered the massive gamble of Apollo 8, right?
Exactly. The American lunar module, the Spider, just wasn't ready yet. It was still severely overweight and behind schedule at the factory.
But George Low, a brilliant manager at NASA, essentially said, screw it. Forget the lander entirely. Let's just take the main command module, put it on top of the Saturn V, and go to the moon right now.
It was an incredible Hail Mary pass just to definitively prevent the Russians from claiming the moon first.
So Apollo 8 goes, orbits the moon at Christmas, and proves the navigation is possible. And that ultimate gamble directly paves the way for July 1969, Apollo 11.
The main event, the absolute culmination of all that heartbreaking tragedy and fierce geopolitical competition.
Let's get deep into the actual journey itself. They launched, they survived that brutal shaking ascent we talked about. Now they're floating safely in Earth orbit, and it's time to actually leave for the moon.
Translunar injection, TLI.
This is the massive engine burn that finally severs the tether to Earth.
Right. They reignite the third stage of the Saturn V and accelerate out of orbit to roughly 24,000 miles per hour.
They're officially falling uphill towards the moon.
And this is exactly where the orbital choreography gets incredibly tricky. Because the lunar module they need to land isn't attached to the front of their ship yet. It's tucked away inside the empty rocket stage behind them.
Right. The spent third stage is essentially acting like a protective garage. The fragile lander is folded up inside it, and the command module, Columbia, is sitting on top.
So Column has to manually separate Columbia from the rocket, physically turn the ship around 180 degrees, fly back, and delicately dock nose to nose with the lander.
All while traveling through the void at 24,000 miles per hour.
Well, their relative speed to each other is very slow, but yes, they are screaming through space. It's a highly delicate maneuver called transposition and docking.
Collins literally has to reach in and pull the Spider out of its garage.
And the pressure on him is immense, because if he bumps too hard and bends the delicate docking probe, they can't connect the ships.
Which means there is absolutely no landing. The mission is an instant failure.
But he nails it perfectly.
Huh.
He glides in, the latches catch, and they slowly pull the Eagle out.
And then they finally open the connecting hatch to equalize the pressure between the two ships. And this brings up a sensory detail from the book that I absolutely love. The smell.
The smell of space.
You just don't inherently think of the vacuum of space as having a recognizable smell.
No, but when they pressurized that docking tunnel and opened the metal hatch, they were immediately hit with a very distinct, sharp odor.
Collins described it as smelling strongly like charred electrical wire or a harsh metallic burn.
Which, given what happened to their friends on Apollo 1, must have instantly stopped their hearts for a terrifying second.
Absolutely. Fire is easily the most terrifying word you can possibly hear in space.
But thankfully, it wasn't a fire at all. It was actually the literal smell of high-energy ions, of the harsh vacuum of space slowly stripping subatomic particles off the metal hull, which then chemically reacted with the oxygen when the cabin air rushed in.
It is quite literally the scent of the void.
Such a wild detail.
So they're finally on their way, coasting, 3 quiet days in the dark. What is mundane daily life actually like inside that little capsule?
Well, first of all, it is incredibly cramped. The entire habitable volume of the command module is roughly the size of a standard family minivan.
A minivan that has to somehow simultaneously serve as your high-tech cockpit, your bedroom, your kitchen, and your toilet for a week.
And to make matters worse, the minivan is constantly slowly spinning.
Right, barbecue mode.
Passive thermal control. Because the thermal environment of deep space is so extreme, the side of the shiny spacecraft facing the sun would literally start to boil, while the side facing the dark void would freeze solid.
So to keep the metal hull from warping or the crucial fuel lines from freezing and cracking, they put the chip into a very slow, continuous roll.
Roughly 3 full revolutions every hour, exactly like a rotisserie chicken slowly turning on a spit.
Let's talk about the incredibly glamorous life of an astronaut. Let's talk about the food.
Well, it had definitely improved somewhat since the early Mercury days of literally squeezing gray paste out of a toothpaste tube.
They had wet packs now. Real food, sealed in plastic. And Buzz's absolute favorite meal was the shrimp cocktail.
Oh yeah, he loved the shrimp.
But why specifically the shrimp? Out of all the options.
It was all about the hot sauce. In zero gravity, without gravity pulling the fluids down into your legs, all the blood and fluid shifts upwards into your head.
So you constantly feel like you have a bad head cold.
Exactly. You get very congested, which completely dulls your sense of taste and smell. Everything tastes incredibly bland.
But the horseradish in the shrimp cocktail was spicy enough to punch right through that congestion.
It was one of the very few things up there that actually had a satisfying kick to it.
But they had to manually rehydrate it, right? Using a little water gun.
Yes. And the water they used wasn't carried from Earth in big tanks. It was actually a chemical byproduct of the ship's fuel cells.
Which mix liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen together to generate electricity.
Right. And the resulting exhaust from that process is pure, hot drinking water. But the system wasn't perfect. The water came out very fizzy, heavily aerated with tiny, unreacted hydrogen gas bubbles.
Which inevitably leads to a lot of gas in the digestive tract.
Lots and lots of gas. And in a sealed minivan with 3 guys, that rapidly becomes a very real social problem.
But the flatulence was nothing compared to the actual bathroom situation.
The arduous ordeal. That is what the astronauts politely called it.
Because there was no actual toilet on the Apollo spacecraft.
None at all. For liquid waste urine, they had a simple relief tube. It was basically just a rubber hose with a roll-on cuff at the end.
You attach yourself, turn a small valve, and the vacuum pressure of space literally sucks the liquid out of the ship and vents it into the void.
Where it instantly freezes into these massive, beautiful, shimmering clouds of urine ice crystals following the ship.
Truly majestic. But for solid waste.
That was the fecal containment system, the bags.
This sounds so miserable.
It was basically just a clear plastic bag with a sticky adhesive ring around the lip. You had to strip naked, which is hard enough to do while floating in a crowded space, and physically stick this bag to your backside.
And just hope for the best.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no gravity pulling anything down into the bag. Nothing naturally separates.
I will spare everyone the truly graphic details, but achieving clean separation from the body was a major, messy issue. They had to use special finger cots built into the side of the bag to manually help things along.
And once you finally finish that horrible process, you aren't done.
No. You had to tear open a small capsule of blue germicide powder, drop it into the sealed bag, and then physically knead the bag with your fingers.
You had to knead your own waste.
Vigorously, to thoroughly mix the germicide in so the bacteria wouldn't produce expanding gas that could pop the bag later.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare. The book says it regularly took them 45 minutes just to go to the bathroom.
And the lingering smell was atrocious. Jim Lovell, who flew on Gemini 7 for 2 whole weeks, famously said that by the end of the mission, the tiny capsule smelled exactly like a ripe latrine.
These guys were undeniably historical heroes, but they were also just 3 unwashed, exhausted men living inside a floating porta-john.
It completely grounds the whole pristine experience. It wasn't some sterile Star Trek fantasy. It was gritty, smelly, and uncomfortable.
And amidst all the constant kneading and eating fizzy shrimp, they still had to somehow navigate this ship across 250,000 miles of nothingness.
Which brings us to the computer, the Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC.
Which was an absolute marvel of miniaturization for the 1960s.
Truly revolutionary. But by today's modern computing standards, it's basically a pocket calculator.
I think my smart toaster honestly has more raw processing power than the Apollo computer.
It had roughly 36 kilobytes of memory.
Total. 36 kilobytes.
But what it lacked in memory, it made up for in pure robustness. The core software wasn't stored on a fragile magnetic disk. It was literally physically hardwired.
Core rope memory.
Right. Woven by hand by teams of expert seamstresses and factories. They threaded tiny copper wires either through or around tiny magnetic rings to represent ones and zeros.
If a wire goes through the ring, it's a 1. If it goes around, it's a 0.
Exactly. The engineers affectionately called it LOL memory, little old lady memory, because it was essentially immune to crashing from radiation or power surges. It was physically woven hardware.
But because that memory capacity was so incredibly limited, the computer couldn't constantly keep track of exactly where it was in space on its own.
Over time, the internal gyroscopes would slowly begin to drift.
So they had to manually realign them in the computer's brain, the P-52 program.
This is where it gets really amazing, because they use a sextant.
A literal sextant, like an 18th century pirate ship navigating the high seas.
Effectively, yes, a high-tech space sextant. Armstrong or Collins would look out through a specialized telescope built into the hull, manually find a very specific navigation star like Rigel or Sirius, and precisely measure the visual angle between that distant star and the curved horizon of the Earth or the Moon.
And then they would manually punch those specific angles into the computer keypad.
And the computer would crunch the trigonometry and say, okay, now I know exactly where I am and which way I'm pointing.
It's just this incredibly poetic blend of ancient celestial navigation and cutting-edge digital processing.
So fast forward a bit. They navigate across the void, and they finally arrive at their destination. They have to perform the Lunar Orbit Insertion Burn, LOI.
They have to fire that big main engine while passing over the far side of the moon to slow themselves down enough to get captured by lunar gravity.
And this is always a terrifying moment for mission control, because if the engine burns even a few seconds too long, they will slow down too much and crash directly into the moon.
But if it shuts down too early,
they won't slow down enough, and they will literally just skip off the moon's gravity well and fly out into deep space forever with no extra fuel to turn back.
And worst of all, they are on the dark side of the moon during this critical burn, completely blocked from all radio contact with Earth.
Houston just has to wait in agonizing silence and hope they come back out from behind the edge.
But they nail the burn perfectly. They swing around the limb of the moon safely in orbit, and that is when they see the Earthrise.
The famous photos really don't even do it justice. The astronauts consistently describe the surface of the moon up close as looking exactly like plaster of Paris.
Just completely gray, dead, and totally monochromatic.
Right. And then, slowly rising silently over that harsh, dead horizon is the Earth. Vividly blue, bright white, teeming with color.
It was literally the only single thing in the entire black sky that had any color to it whatsoever.
Seeing that profound contrast deeply changed them. It made them intimately realize just how incredibly fragile and isolated their home planet really was.
But as profound as that was, they didn't fly all that way just to sightsee out the window. They came to land.
Right.
Which brings us to the core engineering conflict of the entire mission design, the actual method of getting down to the surface.
Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR.
Why was this specific method so intensely controversial in the early days of the program?
Because to a lot of experienced people, it frankly seemed totally suicidal.
Because the original brute force plan was something called direct ascent?
Right. Direct descent was a conceptually simple idea. Just build one single, unimaginably massive rocket. They called it the Nova design fly. It's straight to the moon, land the whole giant thing upright like in a Tintin comic, and then just blast off and fly straight home.
Simple in theory, but impossible in practice.
Exactly. Because to carry enough fuel to do all of that, the rocket taking off from Earth would have to be roughly the size of the Empire State Building.
It was just way too big, way too heavy, and way too expensive to ever actually build.
So they were forced to look at LORAR as an alternative. The idea is you send a mothership and a tiny, specialized, lightweight lander. You leave the mothership safely parked in lunar orbit. You go down in the tiny lander, do your job, fly back up, and find the mothership again to go home.
The massive glaring problem being the finding part.
Right, because if you launch back up off the dusty surface of the moon and your radar fails or your computer crashes and you miss that orbital rendezvous,
If you can't find Michael Collins in the mothership.
you are instantly dead. You are permanently stranded in lunar orbit. You will literally just circle the moon in a freezing tin can until your oxygen runs out.
And there's absolutely no rescue capability whatsoever.
None. The mothership can't come down to get you.
There was one brilliant engineer, John Houbolt, who passionately fought for this risky LORAR concept, right?
He was treated like an absolute pariah for years. The senior management at NASA, including Wernher von Braun initially, legitimately thought he was crazy.
They practically murdered him in high-level meetings. They flat out called his mathematical figures lies.
But Houbolt just kept aggressively pounding the table, basically screaming, do we actually want to go to the moon or not? Because mathematically, this is the only possible way to physically do it before the decade is out.
And eventually, he won the argument.
He won, but his victory meant that the lives of the crew and the success of the entire national endeavor hinged entirely on mastering that complex rendezvous mechanic.
An orbital rendezvous, as Buzz Aldrin proved, is a complete paradox.
The phantom target.
Explain the phantom target concept.
It's the incredibly bizarre physics of orbital mechanics. Let's say you are in orbit right behind your target ship, and you logically think, I need to catch up.
So you thrust forward, you hit the gas.
Right. But in space, thrusting forward adds kinetic energy to your orbit.
Which forcefully pushes your altitude higher against gravity.
Exactly. And higher orbits take longer to complete. They are inherently slower.
So by stepping on the gas to speed up, you actually slow your angular velocity down, and you helplessly drift further and further behind the target.
It is maddening. To successfully catch someone who is ahead of you in orbit, you actually have to fire your retro rockets backwards to slow yourself down.
Which drops your altitude into a much lower, tighter orbit.
And tighter orbits are much faster, so you drop down, sip quickly underneath the target, and then pop back up right in front of them.
It is just completely, utterly counterintuitive to how a human pilot's brain naturally works on Earth.
They really had to force themselves to ruthlessly trust the cold mathematics over their own lying instincts.
So after all of that history, all of that preparation and debate, here we finally are. The outro setup.
The undocking.
The Eagle has finally separated from Columbia. Armstrong and Aldrin are sealed inside the Spider.
And Collins is suddenly all alone inside Columbia.
Just take a second to truly think about the sheer fragility of this exact moment. You have two men standing up inside a tiny, bizarrely shaped craft.
A craft that literally has landing legs made out of crushable aluminum honeycomb material just to absorb the final shock of touching down.
A spacecraft that has absolutely no aerodynamic heat shield.
Right. It can never, ever return to Earth's atmosphere without burning up instantly. It is a true, pure spaceship. A machine completely incapable of existing anywhere except in the deadly vacuum of space.
And you have Collins hovering nearby, watching his two friends slowly spin away into the dark.
He does a careful visual check of their exterior gear, their landing legs, and he famously radios over, "You've got a fine-looking flying machine there, Eagle."
Eerie casual on the radio.
Yeah.
But internally, what is he actually thinking?
Internally, he's terrified. He's looking at them thinking, will I ever actually see these guys again?
He had this deep, secret fear that he would be forced to return to Earth all by himself.
He wrote extensively later about the absolute dread of becoming a marked man for the rest of his life. The guy who survived but had to leave Neil and Buzz dead on the surface of the moon.
And for Armstrong, what was his mental state going down?
Honestly, this is the biggest, most fascinating takeaway from Parry's entire book, because the general public inherently thinks the ultimate goal of the mission was the moonwalk itself.
Right, the one small step for man, putting the boot print in the dust.
But for Neil Armstrong, the actual walk on the surface was almost entirely secondary. It was just an extra bonus.
Because the real ultimate mission to him was just the physical act of landing the ship safely.
Exactly. At his core, he was always an experimental test pilot. The monumental challenge wasn't scooping up rocks. The true challenge was taking this completely untried, terrifyingly fragile, bizarrely designed flying machine and managing to soft land it on an alien world without killing himself.
The ultimate triumph for him was simply surviving long enough to hit the engine shutdown switch.
That was the victory. Everything else was just PR.
And that profound reality brings us all the way back to where we started, to the crater Mascaline W.
The Eagle is descending rapidly.
They are 3 seconds late over their landmarks, which means they are 3 dangerous miles off course.
The descent fuel is rapidly dwindling away to nothing.
And that blaring 1202 alarm is just flashing over and over again on the tiny DSKY computer screen.
The computer is completely overwhelmed by radar data. The pilot is temporarily blind to where the actual landing site is.
And the rocky lunar ground is just rushing up to meet them at incredible speed.
That intense, hyper-focused moment is exactly where the romanticized legend finally meets the stark reality. The true greatness of Apollo 11 wasn't forged in the easy flag planting. It was forged in those final 12 minutes of absolute terrifying chaos.
And that is exactly where we are going to leave you today. Just hanging out there 40,000 feet above the harsh lunar surface with the master alarms blaring in your ears.
With the ultimate cool-headed test pilot quietly taking manual control of the stick to try and save them all.
It truly is the ultimate historical cliffhanger.
Absolutely.
So later tonight, when you walk outside and you look up at the moon glowing in the dark sky, don't just lazily think about a static footprint sitting in the dust.
No, think about the massive shrinking rocket groaning on the pad.
Think about the ridiculous dead fish that Michael Collins secretly packed as a joke for the pad leader.
Think about the harsh, metallic smell of burnt wire lingering in the docking tunnel.
And most importantly, think about the absolutely terrifying fragility of the thin metal machine that actually carried them across that void.
Because it wasn't a preordained miracle. It was desperate human engineering holding on tight by its very fingernails.
And actually, here's one final thought for you to just sort of mull over on your own.
Oh, I like a good parting thought.
Imagine the sheer psychological weight of coming home after that. You are in your 30s, you are sitting in your backyard looking up at the night sky, and you realize you have already physically stood on that distant rock.
Right.
You have peaked. You have achieved the absolute pinnacle of human exploration, and you know with absolute certainty that you will never, ever get to go back. How do you possibly just go back to mowing the lawn after that?
That is heavy. Truly a heavy burden.
Thanks for diving in with us today.
See you on the surface.